Imagine waking up before sunrise, not in China, but in a world that does not know it will one day become China. The country outside your door has no name yet. The land you stand on belongs to a kingdom that has existed for generations, that has its own songs, its own coins, its own way of counting days. Your neighbors speak a dialect your grandparents taught you. Your ancestors are buried in the soil behind your house, and you speak to them every morning before you eat. This is not the past. This is Tuesday. You have never heard the word empire. You have never needed to. And yet, somewhere beyond the mountains to the west, something is already moving. Most people who have heard of ancient China picture one thing: the Great Wall, the terracotta soldiers, a single emperor standing at the center of a vast unified world. But before all of that, before the unification, before the standardization, before the empire, there was something else entirely, something more complicated, more varied, and in many ways more human. There was a world of 7 competing kingdoms, each with its own texture, its own rhythms, its own sense of what a normal life looked like. And the people living inside that world had no idea it was about to end. In this documentary, we are going inside that world, not the world of courts and campaigns, but the world of early mornings and bowls of millet, of markets full of sound, of farmers who prayed for rain, of physicians who pressed your wrist and read the future in your pulse. We are going into the daily life that existed before China became one empire. A life that was, in nearly every way, astonishing, and that disappeared so completely that most people today have no idea it ever existed. The period historians call the Warring States lasted roughly from 475 to 221 BCE. 7 major kingdoms: Qin in the west, Chu in the south, Qi in the east, Zhao, Wei, Han, and Yan further north, competed, negotiated, collapsed, and rebuilt themselves across 2.5 centuries of constant pressure. This is not the era of a unified China. This is an era of 7 distinct worlds living side by side, each one convinced that its way of doing things was simply the way things were done. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that rarely gets discussed, is that most people living inside those 7 worlds were not experiencing history. They were experiencing Tuesday. They were grinding grain, mending sandals, arguing with neighbors about borrowed tools, worrying about the harvest, consulting a diviner about a strange dream. The large machinery of kingdoms operated somewhere far above them, and they felt its weight mainly in taxes and in the occasional knock on the door from a conscription officer. Dawn in the Warring States world arrived without alarm clocks or church bells. It arrived with roosters and the smell of smoke from the kitchen fire, which had been kept carefully through the night because restarting it was a time-consuming business. The household was already moving before the sun cleared the horizon. In most farming families across the Yellow River Basin, the dense agricultural heartland of the north, the first task was fuel, then fire, then water. Wells were shared among clusters of houses, and the walk there and back was the morning's first labor before anyone had eaten. What they ate for that first meal was almost always millet, a small, fast-growing grain that had been the core of northern Chinese agriculture for thousands of years, boiled into a thick gruel, eaten with whatever vegetables were available, supplemented in luckier households with pickled foods preserved from the harvest. The grain did not taste like much, but it held you together, which was the point. In the southern kingdom of Chu, rice replaced millet as the foundation of daily eating. What united people across all 7 kingdoms was not their rulers or their laws. It was the fact that almost everyone was, in some fundamental way, organized around the question of grain. Ordinary people in Warring States China ate 2 meals a day. 3 meals was a privilege of the wealthy. This rhythm, 1 meal in the morning, 1 in the late afternoon, shaped the entire architecture of the workday. You did not graze, You did not snack. You planned your energy around 2 anchor points, and everything else followed. Meat was rare on the daily table. Pork was the most commonly eaten animal flesh, but even pork was reserved for significant occasions. Festivals, ancestor observances, the arrival of a guest. Dog meat was also eaten, particularly in the north, and was not considered low or shameful. It was simply food. The working animals, the oxen that pulled the plow, the horses far too valuable for the table, were kept alive because they were worth more working than eaten. Fish appeared regularly in households near rivers or lakes, but for most people across most of the 7 kingdoms, the day's protein came from beans. Soybeans were everywhere. Boiled, fermented, ground and pressed, and eaten in forms that bore little resemblance to the original bean. A fermented paste that was an ancestor of soy sauce existed in this period. A dark, salt-heavy condiment made from fermented grain or legume that could transform the plainest bowl into something that almost felt like a meal. Salt itself was among the most critical substances in the entire economy. Every household needed it. Every state knew it. The kingdoms that controlled salt production, particularly coastal Qi and the interior deposits of Shu, held an economic advantage as powerful as any army. Most people never thought about this. They thought about whether they could afford to buy it. The houses were built primarily of rammed earth walls and wooden frames, with thatch roofs in the countryside, and tile in wealthier or urban settings. A typical farming family occupied 2 or 3 rooms, a main room used for sleeping, eating, and ancestor rituals, and a smaller side room used as a kitchen and storage. There was very little furniture by any modern definition. People sat on mats on the floor. They slept on raised earth platforms in the colder north, which could be heated from below with the same fire that cooked the food. Chairs did not yet exist in China during this period. That came later, carried along trade routes from further west. If you visited a warring state's household and tried to find somewhere to sit, you would sit on the floor. Everyone did. The courtyard was the true heart of a household. Even modest farming families organized their lives around an open central space. The courtyard was where food was prepared in better weather, where tools were mended, and where the household spirit shrines were maintained. The ancestors did not live in a temple down the road. They lived in the house, in small wooden tablets inscribed with names, set into niches in the wall of the main room. And they were not passive residents. They were active members of the household who needed to be kept informed, fed, and propitiated. This relationship with the dead is difficult to overstate in importance. Ancestor veneration was not a religion in the way we might use that word today. It had no clergy, no single text, no institutional structure. It was the bedrock of how most people understood the relationship between the living and the dead. When you woke up in a warring state's home, before you ate or spoke to your family, you acknowledged the ancestors. You offered them a portion of the morning's food, set before the tablet, with a brief verbal acknowledgement. If something important was happening, a marriage, a journey, a serious illness, the ancestors were informed. Their spirits were believed to remain active in the world, capable of bringing fortune or misfortune depending on how well they had been cared for. A family without sons faced a crisis not only of labor and inheritance, but of spiritual continuity. Without male descendants to perform the rites, the ancestors would eventually become what the text called hungry ghosts, neglected spirits who turned malevolent out of abandonment. The household also turned to other forms of spiritual navigation. Diviners were practitioners who could be consulted for practical decisions, whether to make a journey, whether a particular day was auspicious for a marriage, whether a dream carried an omen. One common method involved the cracking of heated bones or shells to read patterns that a trained practitioner could interpret. This tradition stretched back to the Shang dynasty and had evolved into a widespread practice across all 7 kingdoms. You did not need to be wealthy to consult a diviner. You needed a question urgent enough to be worth the fee, which might be paid in grain or cloth. Medicine operated alongside divination, not against it. The physicians of warring states China worked within a framework connecting the body to the same invisible forces that governed the weather, the harvest, and the cosmos. What we now call traditional Chinese medicine was being actively developed during this period, not as folklore, but as a genuine intellectual project carried out by practitioners who wrote, debated, and transmitted their knowledge through texts. The concept of qi, the vital energy circulating through the body along pathways a physician could read and influence, was being formalized in this era. A physician pressing your wrist in a market town was not guessing. He was interpreting information according to a sophisticated system refined over generations. He might prescribe herbal compounds, acupuncture, specific foods, or changes in daily habit. The physicians and the diviners coexisted not as rivals, but as parallel specialists addressing different dimensions of the same problem. If you were sick, you might consult both. This was not confusion. It was thoroughness. What did the markets of the warring states world look like? Here, the historical record becomes vivid and slightly startling. The city of Linzi, capital of the state of Qi, located in what is now Shandong province, was by the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE one of the most densely populated urban centers in the world. Contemporary accounts describe streets so crowded that cartwheels scraped against each other. People jostled so close that the sweat from one fell on the necks like rain, and the sound of pipes and zithers filled the air at all hours. Estimates based on the records of the Grand Historian suggest something in the range of 70,000 households within a 14-kilometer perimeter of rammed earth walls. In that city, there were state-controlled markets with specific zones where specific goods could be bought and sold. Commerce was not free in the modern sense. It was regulated, licensed, taxed. But within those regulations, the markets were genuinely astonishing. You could buy silk cloth in dozens of weights and qualities. You could find lacquerware, bowls, cups, containers, painted in swirling red and black patterns that were, by the Warring States period, affordable to households well below the aristocracy. Lacquerware production had industrialized enough to bring beautiful objects within reach of ordinary people for the first time. You could buy iron tools, medicines, dried herbs, preserved foods. You could hire a scribe to write a letter if you could not write yourself. You could find people selling musical instruments, board games, and in certain corners of certain markets, bets on cockfights or dog races. The idea that ancient China was solemn and still. This is one of the most persistent and most wrong impressions of the period. And the coins those markets ran on were different in every kingdom, which is a detail that sounds minor until you understand what it meant in practice. Chai used a round bronze coin with a hole in the center, relatively familiar to us in appearance. Zhao used spade-shaped coins, heavy bronze castings that looked like miniature agricultural tools, because they had evolved from actual tokens of exchange based on real implements. Yan used knife-shaped coins, long, thin bronze pieces with a ring at one end, visually unmistakable. And Chu used a particularly unusual currency, small bronze pieces shaped roughly like cowrie shells, continuing an ancient tradition of shell-based exchange that stretched back centuries. A merchant crossing from Zhao into Qi with a bag of spade coins was not carrying cash. He was carrying metal that needed to be converted. This created a whole profession of money changers, and it made long-distance trade simultaneously necessary and genuinely complicated. The writing on a document from Chu looked different from a document from Qin. Not incomprehensibly different. An educated person from one kingdom could generally puzzle out another's text, the way a Spanish speaker can work through Portuguese. But the characters had diverged enough over centuries of regional use that the visual experience of reading across kingdoms was distinctly foreign. A key scholar visiting Yan would notice immediately that the writing on market signs and administrative records had a slightly alien quality. This mattered because the knowledge held in books, philosophical texts, agricultural manuals, medical treatises, histories, was not freely portable. A library in Ying meant something different to a reader from Lindsay. Agriculture was the floor on which all of this rested, and the Warring States period was a time of remarkable agricultural transformation. The iron plow had been spreading across China since roughly the 6th century BCE. Before the iron plow, breaking new ground was a project of enormous human labor. The iron plow attached to an ox changed the calculation entirely. It meant that marginal land, rocky hillsides, dense clay soils, areas previously not worth farming, suddenly became worth farming. Wastelands that had served as buffer zones between kingdoms began to disappear as farmers pushed into them. This created new taxable land, which funded armies, which drove the conflicts that defined the era. The iron plow is not usually mentioned in the same breath as the great battles of the Warring States period. It should be. It helped cause them. The relationship between a farming family and the land they worked had been changing throughout this period. The old communal land arrangements that required labor service directly to lords were breaking down. States were moving toward a system where individual families were recognized as having specific rights to specific pieces of land, taxed directly in grain. This was not simply an administrative change. It was a psychological shift. For the first time, in many states, a farming family could call their land their own. They could pass it to their descendants. The land was no longer something lent by a noble. It was something they worked for themselves. In practice, this also meant they could lose it. Debt was the great threat lurking behind the freedom of land ownership. A bad harvest, an illness that kept adults from working, a conscription notice that took the strongest men away at planting time. Any of these could push a family into borrowing. And debt could lead to selling the land to a wealthier neighbor who had accumulated enough surplus to become a creditor. Freedom and precarity arrived together. They usually do. The men who left farming families to fight in the armies of the Seven Kingdoms experienced this precarity in the most direct way. Mass infantry armies were the military reality of the Warring States, not the chariot-based noble warfare of earlier centuries, but enormous conscripted forces drawn from the farming population. A young man summoned for service received a weapon, often a crossbow, a technology developed in China by around 400 BCE that democratized killing in a way that alarmed aristocrats who had grown up thinking war was their profession, and marched wherever the campaign required. The distance could be enormous. A farmer from the Zhao heartland in what is now Hebei, marching on a Qin campaign, might travel hundreds of kilometers over entirely unfamiliar terrain, eating rations barely sufficient, sleeping in conditions that the historical record describes with a matter-of-factness that obscures real suffering. What happened to the farm while he was gone? His family managed it. Whatever labor remained worked the land. If he died in the campaign, the farm continued without him. If he returned injured, the farm had to absorb the cost of a body that could no longer do full work. The gap between a farm with its full complement of adult workers and one that had lost one or two was the gap between subsistence and disaster. Marriage in this world was not a private matter. It was a transaction between families, negotiated by intermediaries who assessed compatibility not in terms of personal affection, though that could exist, but in terms of family standing, ancestral compatibility, economic resources, and astrological alignment. A matchmaker would carry proposals between families, assess the other party's household, and report back. Gifts moved from the groom's family to the bride's in quantities that reflected the seriousness of the commitment. These were not purely symbolic. They represented a real transfer of value. A wedding ceremony involved the bride leaving her natal household with a formal procession and being installed in her husband's home, where she was presented to his ancestors as a new member of the family. The moment she bowed before those tablets, she had changed families in a spiritual sense at least as significant as the legal one. She now had new ancestors to venerate. This was understood, by everyone involved, as a transformation of identity, not simply a change of address. The philosophical life of the Warring States period was astonishing in ways that have no real parallel in any other ancient civilization of the same era. Thinkers gathered in courts, academies, and private schools to argue about the most fundamental questions of human organization. How should a ruler govern? What did people owe the state? And what did the state owe the people? Was human nature fundamentally good or fundamentally self-interested? The Jixia Academy in Lindsay was possibly the first institution of its kind, a place where the state actively invited scholars of many different schools to live, think, and debate. Subsidized by the royal court as a mark of prestige, thinkers representing Confucian, Taoist, legalist, and Mohist traditions were all present simultaneously, arguing with each other in an intellectual climate that was genuinely plural. Ideas traveled. The debates in Lindsay eventually shaped policies, laws, rituals. The ordinary farmer who never read Mencius still felt Mencius's influence through the texture of the laws that governed his fields. What nobody in this world knew was that their calendar, their coins, their writing, their rituals, and their very sense of where they belonged were all operating on borrowed time. In the western kingdom of Qin, something had been quietly changing for a century. The legalist reforms implemented from around 356 BCE onward had transformed Qin into a machine of unprecedented administrative efficiency. The household registration system, recording every family in organized units of 5 and 10 households, making every person visible to the state for taxation, corvée, and conscription, was already operational in Qin while other kingdoms still relied on more informal arrangements. In Qin, you could not move from one village to another without permission from the local administrator. You could not hold a traveler in your home for more than a night without registering their presence. The state knew where you were. Always. And what Qin had discovered was that a state which knows where every person is and can reach every person with demands is a dramatically more powerful machine than one that cannot. But the farmers of Qi eating their morning millet, the weavers of Chu working their looms, the merchants of Lindsay arguing prices in the state market, none of them felt the approaching end of their world as anything other than the ordinary pressure of difficult times. Wars happened. Armies passed through. Taxes went up. Life continued at its 2-meal-a-day rhythm, organized around the ancestors in the wall niche and the iron plow in the shed. The moment of ending, when it came, was not a single visible event. It was a sequence of absorptions. Han in 230 BCE, Zhao in 228 BCE, Wei in 225 BCE, Chu in 223 BCE, Yan in 222 BCE, and finally Qi in 221 BCE, the last remaining kingdom, which surrendered without a major battle because resistance had become genuinely unimaginable. In 221 BCE, for the first time in Chinese history, there was only one authority, one set of laws, one ruler. What did that feel like from the inside? The people living in what had been Qi did not discover overnight that their identity had changed. They woke up, they ground their millet, they checked on the ancestors, but the coins in their pocket were now suspect. The writing on official documents was being standardized to Qin script, which meant the characters their grandparents had used were being rendered unofficial. The weights and measures they had used in trade, the units every merchant knew by feel and habit, were being replaced by the Qin standard. This sounds trivial. It is actually disorienting in the way that any long-held certainty, when altered, produces a specific kind of quiet grief. The noble families of the conquered kingdoms were relocated to the Qin capital, far from the graves of their own ancestors. The rituals could not be performed at a distance in the same way. The dead were in one place. The living had been moved to another. The rupture was not abstract. It was expressed in a very specific morning routine that could no longer be completed properly. History remembers the first emperor. History remembers the standardizations and the wall. What history rarely lingers on is the ordinary cost of living through the moment when a plural world becomes a singular one. The woman whose family had traded in Zhao spade coins for 4 generations suddenly holding chin-round coins that felt wrong in her hands. The physician whose medical knowledge was transmitted in Chu script, now required to use a standardized form his teachers had never used. The farmer who had once marked time partly by the festival calendar of his kingdom, now discovering that the empire had its own calendar, which did not always align with the rituals his family had performed for as long as anyone could remember. These are not dramatic losses. They do not look like battles or executions. They look like Tuesday, except that Tuesday is slightly different in a way that keeps accumulating until the world you knew is no longer the world you're living in. The extraordinary thing is how much survived anyway. The ancestor veneration practiced in a Zhao farmhouse in 300 BCE persists, in evolved forms, across Chinese communities today. The agricultural rhythms, the spring planting, the autumn harvest, the winter rest, shaped a calendar that still underlies the Lunar New Year cycle that hundreds of millions observe. The philosophical traditions debated in the Jixia Academy became the Confucian foundations that structured Chinese intellectual life for 2,000 years. Even the Iron Plow, that quiet revolution that made the Warring States wars possible, persisted in Chinese agriculture for centuries after the empire that ended the Warring States had itself collapsed. The kingdoms were erased. The habits of the people who had lived inside them were not so easily erased. They went underground. They survived in dialect, in local ritual, in the specific way a family in what had been Chu prepared a particular dish that they would have been unable to explain had any imperial official asked. They cooked it that way because their parents had cooked it that way. And their parents had learned it in a world that no longer officially existed. The world before China became one empire was not simpler than what followed. It was not more peaceful. It was not more just, but it was more varied, in a way that had taken centuries to develop, and that was extinguished, administratively, in a generation. And that variety, the different coins, the different scripts, the different songs, the different faces of the same human question about how to live, is worth knowing about, because it is the thing that unification replaced. Not with nothing, with something enormous and real and lasting, but still, not with nothing. The people who lived through the change remembered what came before. They did not write about it mostly. Their successors did not celebrate it. The empire preferred unity to memory, but somewhere in the accumulated habits of the survivors, in the way a merchant who had grown up in Qi counted on his fingers, in the way a Chu farmer's widow arranged the ancestor tablets, the plural world persisted, quietly, doing what habits always do when the systems that produce them have been declared officially ended. It survived by being too small to notice. And if the world that existed before the First Empire is this complex and this human, if this is what daily life looked like before everything changed, then the world inside that empire becomes an even stranger question. What happened to all of this? Once a single authority decided it knew better than generations of varied human habit. What did it feel like to live inside the machine that had just swallowed 7 different worlds? That is the question for another time.